The genes of you and me, we're all made of DNA. We're all made of the same chemical DNA. We're all made of DNA.
Hello, and welcome to the 7th episode of Discovering New Advances, or DNA, a podcast that keeps you up to date about the scientific world in an easy-to-understand language. So whether you're a student in middle school or a grandparent, you will easily be able to follow along. I'm Kira.
I'm Matt.
And on this episode, we will host our first debate about a bioethical issue our society is facing today, gene therapy and gene theft. The following episodes will either keep you updated on genetic advances in the scientific world, teach more lessons on genetics, or feature another debate about controversial bioethic issues. If you're already familiar with gene therapy or gene theft, you can skip to the following episodes about news on the genetic advances happening today and how it's affecting our world, or listen to our debates about bioethical issues. For more information, please visit dnapodcast.com or email us at info@dnapodcast.com. Before we begin our heated debate, let's first take a look at what gene therapy and theft is.
Starting with gene theft, also known as DNA theft, it is the act of collecting genetic material of a human. The genetic information is usually collected from public places without the permission of the individual. Items such as, used cups, napkins, disposable utensils. DNA can be extracted from these materials and can be tested. The DNA of someone can reveal a lot about them, and by analyzing the DNA, it can expose a disease or use for a paternity test. Overall, it can be used to discover a person's genetic information. So, what are some examples of cases where DNA theft can be used? Some examples can be before a team offers a player $1 million contract, they could analyze his or her DNA to confirm they don't have any fatal health conditions, and that could be an issue down the road. Some other ones would be like the movie Gattaca. One could analyze a future spouse's DNA to see if they are a carrier for any diseases their children could possibly inherit. Also like Gattaca would be a company could analyze the DNA of a future employee before hiring them. If a person has a high chance of being affected by a disease, they probably won't want to take the risk of hiring that employee and instead will hire someone else who's not as qualified but doesn't have those kinds of risks for a disease.
Or the same qualifications, but they don't have predisposed to different diseases, that they're a more stable employee.
This is an interesting one would be like crazy fans of celebrities could pay to have their idol's DNA analyzed.
That would be interesting. That's kind of the craziest one out of the bunch.
People that claim to be related to famous deceased people could be proven correct or incorrect.
That's a useful one.
Yeah. And parents looking to adopt a child could analyze their DNA to learn what diseases they are predisposed to. At the Human Genetics Commission in 2006, Great Britain criminalized the acquiring of DNA without consent. And also the Australian government is currently debating a similar criminal offense to the British DNA theft law. Germany outlaws genetic testing unless it is conducted by qualified doctors, and the doctors have consent from all the involved parties. And currently in America, only around 12 states have laws against DNA theft, the toughest being Alaska, where it is required to have a written consent from the individual whose DNA is being tested. And in Massachusetts, the Genetic Bill of Rights, which states that individuals should have property rights over their own DNA. And overall, the main issue is going to be informed consent. Along with the state level, the federal level also has intervened on people's rights when it comes to their DNA. Almost all legislative efforts focus on protecting individuals from genetic discrimination when it comes to employers and health insurers. Most of these laws can be worked around by sending DNA samples to be analyzed overseas to the U.S. where it is legal. Final statement would be that anyone can acquire a person's DNA and analyze it for their benefit.
And that's where the controversy starts coming in.
Yes. Now we're going to get into our debate, and our essential question for this topic is that should the public legally be allowed to steal others' DNA for analysis?
I'm going to be taking the pro side of the debate, and Matt is going to be taking the con. So in this debate, I am arguing that DNA theft should be legal, and Matt is arguing that DNA theft should not be legal. Matt, why do you think DNA theft should be illegal?
Okay. Well, the main ethical reason for it is that it's an invasion of personal privacy associated with DNA theft. And what's interesting about this is that one of the sources I found, which is Gene Nappers, Like Identity Thieves, New Threat of the Digital Age from the New Haven Register. A lot of my information I got from that source was saying that for fees as low as $175, DNA laboratories will provide a wide range of tests on genetic samples recovered from common objects. Basically, what is that saying is that it's making it more readily available for people who can, obviously it's because it's a very inexpensive amount to do a DNA test. It makes it more easily for people to invade that personal privacy and go against that space. The theft can become illegal if no new law is passed allowing companies to do complete background checks on their new hires. A lot of the states do make it illegal, but...
You're saying that a lot of states have laws against companies doing that, but that's kind of the extent of the laws. They don't really go into the public. There's no, public laws in the United States, at least, that say that, other than Alaska. So a lot of states in the United States don't have laws that prohibit citizens from stealing each other's DNA and analyzing it, where there are some laws that restrict companies from stealing future employees' DNA.
And some laws have been in place, though. So, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act of 2008, it prohibits employers and insurers from using that DNA information. But the thing about this act is that it only applies to people in the work environment. It doesn't apply to someone on the street who wants to do a background check. So, essentially, an example would be, it could enhance the rate of crime. So criminals, for example, could one day acquire the capability to copy DNA of innocent people and deposit it at crime scenes, endangering the blameless and undermining a key tool of forensic investigation. So they could be putting the blame on somebody else and leaving the genetic trail, the trail leading to that person, and completely avoiding that criminal.
But don't you think that, just like everything else, that we would develop technologies to identify which is the criminal and which is kind of the pseudo DNA that's not the DNA of the criminal? I feel like if we've already gotten this far where we can identify DNA of the victim versus the criminal, wouldn't they be able to throw another variable in there and still be able to find out the criminal? I feel like we could accommodate for that.
But I also feel like at the rate that the crime is continuing to increase now, it's very secretive now. Whereas normally we would have a normal bank robbery where we'd be able to catch the criminal right out there, but it's a lot of underground stuff that the police really can't figure out, or the forensic or the CSI can't figure out, and it's going to take a long time for them to be able to discover that this trail led us the wrong way, whereas the criminal could already be going on to another scene and leaving another trail.
I mean, that's true, but a lot of criminals have a past of, crime. So if you have some DNA that is registered in the CODIS, which is a database for criminals, a DNA database. If they register there while an innocent citizen registers, they're probably going to go with the person that has a criminal background and go with that lead because that has more of a promise. So before you mentioned a couple different scenarios of how DNA theft could be used, and one of them I think you mentioned was a spouse has the right to know what they're signing up for before they get married. And so I think they should be allowed to know what the possible diseases their children might be predisposed to, or which genetic disorders they might be inheriting. I think if you're getting married to someone, you're signing up for that, kind of you're making an agreement. And I think you have to know everything that's going into it before you get married and before you kind of make that a concrete decision. And this concept relates to a lot of things, like you said before, companies, teams, and even parents. And I think they all have the right to know exactly what they're signing up for, and I think it's become so prevalent that, as you said, it's so easy that there's a lot of different companies that the public can use, like 23andMe, Navi Genetics, and Decode Me, and they all promise to identify predispositions to numerous diseases and health conditions. It's so hard because there's so many opportunities for the public to analyze DNA that it's too hard to regulate. You have all these companies that you can send in DNA where there's no really verification at any step in the process of these private companies where you have to verify it's your own DNA to submit. Right now, I could take your DNA, Matt, send it to 23andMe, and get results back. There's nothing where I need to verify that's my DNA. So it gets crazy, even if the government, bioethically, they should be regulating and restricting DNA theft, how would they begin to do that? So it starts getting it gets difficult to the point where it's really, you really can't do that.
But see, you're saying that it's really hard to put in the regulation.
Right, it starts,
this.
yeah,
But
it's inconceivable.
We
like,
discussed before that, like in the lesson, it's about informed consent. And essentially, like a lot of countries and states have already put in laws that, such as like the British government implemented the Human Tissue Act in 2006, which is criminalizing genetic testing on human residue without the subject's consent. And the offenders risk up to 3 years in prison. So they are putting laws in place for this without putting in the informed consent. Essentially what the British government is saying is that it's okay to test somebody, but they need to approve it first. So example, for a job application, the employer has the right to say, could you do like a cotton swab of your cheek tissue or anything?
Or take the cup they drank from. That's a very common thing.
But they want to say, could you hand this to me so we can do a background check? So, but that's when it's allowed. That's when it's legal. And some other examples would be like states, Alaska, Florida, New Jersey, and New York call for fines or short jail sentences for individuals caught swiping DNA. So it's not really that they don't have approval to do it. It's that they're doing it illegally without someone agreeing to having their DNA analyzed.
But even if you had laws in place where you would have to have informed consent, because I feel like that is a reasonable solution, that if you have informed consent, you can run these tests. But without the informed consent, you're stuck. You can't analyze the DNA of the individual. How would you start to have these private companies get the informed consent? Because a lot of these are kind of online companies that you can, cotton swab someone's mouth, or even, a hair off their hairbrush, or, some spit off their toothbrush or something, that you can just send that in. How would these online companies like 23andMe regulate that? Because you're just sending it in to them.
It would probably have to be something like the person who sends it into 23andMe would have to be a registered member. And as a registered member, they would already have all the personal information of that member. Or
they would have to go to a headquarters.
Yes, and such as already have the file of their of their code.
Mm-hmm.
So that when they send, say, it would have to be a reason why you're being a member here, because you're an employer, and you have to show proof of that you're actually being a member of this company for a reason. You're not just doing it so you could go against ethical
just so you can analyze someone else's DNA for your own personal benefit.
I was an employer, and that's my job. I am a headhunter, and I'm registered for 23andMe. That's what it's called, right?
That's one of them, yes.
Okay, and they would ask me, why do you want to be here? Because I'm a headhunter. I'm helping people find jobs, and there are certain requirements that these employers have, and I want to make sure that they already match to these requirements.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be a way that the companies would start putting in this legislation.
But then are you saying that, the average Joe can't get their own DNA run?
They could, but why would they need to?
Well, for instance, anybody, I'm personally interested to have my DNA run and see what diseases I'm predisposed to. If it says I'm predisposed to a heart condition, maybe I will eat better food so that I don't add to that.
Okay.
I feel like people have the right to have their own DNA analyzed so they have that knowledge.
I get what you're saying. I know you're really taking a big scientific perspective on this, but I want to take a more ethical thing about this. I know that this is an ethical thing, but a lot of the research I've done focuses a lot on this topic about religion. A lot of people who religiously believe that it's more of just that you have to live life the way that God gave you. The whole point of life is to discover new things about yourself, even if they're the bad things. So that's why Gattaca raises this whole big ethical dilemma that
the movie he's referring to.
That they already know that he's predisposed to a severe heart condition. That he can't do anything in life that involves physical activity because his heart could rupture and something he could die. And that the whole religious thing, that goes the whole against on what God gave you, that God put you here, and throughout life you're supposed to discover these new things about yourself. You're supposed to take life to its fullest, and I feel like some people believe that this is restricting it, that you already know everything about yourself, that things that you're not supposed to know, you already know it. It's completely against on what your religious belief is.
But at the same time, I think science and religion obviously have kind of battled it out through the years, but I think there can be a common ground where, yes, maybe you don't know all the diseases you're going to get, but when you analyze DNA, you don't have to know everything. You can just know crucial things like, hey, look, you're predisposed to have diabetes, so, type 2, like, you should, watch your diet because maybe you could save your own life.
Right.
When it comes to life and death, I feel that people should have the right, if they want to, know their own DNA. If you're religious and you don't want to know, that's your personal decision. But for people that want to know, they have the right to know if the technology is out there.
But what also I'm saying is that suppose you have your DNA run and you come out that you're predisposed for a severe cancer that can't be treated. So that leaves you with the question, are you going to live life to its fullest, or are you just going to end your life because there's no point living because you're going to die anyway? Because you know you're going to die. So that raises also, is there going to be more suicides? Because if people already know they're predisposed to these conditions, or is there going to be a more sense of like joy and care and being carefree because they're trying to live life as much as they can before they die?
I think some people, if they find out they have a terminal disease, will kind of put their life kind of in more of a fast forward kind of mode. Like if they were thinking like, I'll get married whenever I'm dating and it works out, that's fine. But if they have a terminal disease, they know they're going to get Huntington's, for example, and they're going to die somewhere in their 40s, then maybe they'll make it a point to get married earlier, have kids earlier, and that way they'll be able to experience that. If it wasn't for DNA testing, they wouldn't have that kind of heads up.
Do you really want to put like the despair on your family that you know you're going to die, but you're still creating a family and you're still having someone who loves you and cares about you so much, and you're still willing to leave them through life and then all of a sudden leave them, and it's such you know that you're going to die?
I think it's a personal decision that if someone wanted to go that route, they have the choice and it's up to them. But for people that don't want to put their loved ones through that heartbreak, or future loved ones, then they would, refrain from doing that and just, stick to their normal life.
So, going back to what we're actually talking about, I know we got a sidetrack. So, the actual concept of theft, which is going to be considered an illegal criminal action, obviously should be illegal. I think you agree with that too.
I do.
But I think for the sake of someone knowing their own genetic code, that is acceptable.
Yeah.
But I think in the process of taking someone's personal information that they have the right to know and using it to their advantage is illegal.
I think that's where, like, as we said before, informed consent comes in so that, if you want to have your own DNA analyzed, then you can, and that's where, you use informed consent to regulate that. And I think that's kind of the common ground that comes into play. So, I think overall, we would both agree that that would be the way to go, and that's kind of how to solve the issue, or begin to solve the issue.
Right.
So now let's get into gene therapy.
So a little background about genes is that they code for proteins, and when the genes are mutated, the proteins can be negatively affected. Proteins can malfunction and cause genetic diseases. So gene therapy is a relatively new technological process that can prevent, treat, or even cure disease by correcting defective genes. There are a few different approaches to gene therapy doctors are currently trying. The first is replacing a mutated gene that causes disease with a healthy copy of the gene. And activating a mutated gene that is functioning improperly. This is also known as knocking out a gene. And the third is inserting a new gene into the body that can help fight a disease. In this most common type of gene therapy, where a new gene is introduced to the body, a vector is used to deliver the gene to specific target cells. The most common type of vector is a virus. Viruses can be genetically altered to carry human DNA. Once the vector sticks onto the cell, it can deposit the genetic information into the cell.
So on September 14th, 1990, the first person with genetic disorder was cured with gene therapy. And she was a 4-year-old girl who suffered because her body didn't produce a crucial enzyme, we'll call it ADA for short, which resulted in her having a weakened immune system. So the National Institutes of Health's Clinical Center in Bethesda, Maryland, took white blood cells from the girl and inserted the ADA-producing gene she was missing into the white blood cells they had taken out of her. They then inserted them back into the girl. As a result, the girl's immune system's tolerance was greatly increased. So that was a happy story. However, there have been a lot of setbacks in gene therapy. The most major, arguably, was in 1999 when 18-year-old Jesse Gelsinger died after going through a gene therapy trial hoping to cure his OCTD, which stands for ornithine transcarboxylase deficiency. So his death was ultimately from multiple organ failures 4 days after starting the therapy, which is believed to have been triggered by a severe immune response to the adenovirus carrier. Another setback was in January 2003 when the Food and Drug Administration, also known as FDA, temporarily halted all gene therapy trials that used retroviral vectors in blood stem cells. This happened after a second child treated in a French gene therapy trial had developed a leukemia-like condition. A few months later, in April of 2003, the ban was lifted. So it was only, 4 months later. So it wasn't too long of a time period. So because scientists and doctors are still learning how to perform gene therapy, and there are many risks involved in the process, it's only used if the disease has no other known cure. That's a very crucial part. It's only used if the disease has no other known cure. However, in the future, these processes could possibly replace drugs and surgery once we learn more about it. So the FDA has currently not approved any human gene therapy product for sale. Okay, so now that we have some background information about gene therapy, we'll go into our debate. Again, I will be the pro, and Matt will be arguing the con. Okay, so I think the cost of gene therapy is worth any price because it saves people's lives. That's the bottom line. Gene therapy has an incredible therapeutic potential. Genetic disorders have no cures unless the defective gene is replaced by the correct one. So this is precisely what gene therapy aims at. People suffering from genetic disorders' only hope for a cure is through genetic therapy. So I believe the public should have a right to the possible cures when there's no other way to achieve a cure for the diseases.
To an extent, I do agree with what you're saying. Mm-hmm. I'm more concerned about the whole process of, first of all, the cost of gene therapy and also the concept of designer babies. Now, first of all, gene therapy is this new theory new therapy technique that has just been invented. And
it's not really a theory because they have used it.
It's a new technique.
Yes.
Sorry. And questions of safety have still been raised and still have to be tested. And therefore, in order for this to be considered safe, there needs to be more research is needed to prove that, which equals more funding. And the question will be where are these research facilities going to get that funding from? Are we going to end up paying more taxes for it, so that funding, or are we going to have to pay more premiums in our insurance? So that's a major question. Do people don't want to pay more money, but also they want this research to happen?
I think there's an easy fix for that. Private companies can do research on this, and the government can pay them once they find information. So you're not paying for research where you're not getting any answers. You're only paying for... I think there's an easy fix to that because private companies can do research and the government doesn't necessarily have to pay them. So you can have these private companies be doing their own research and, the people don't have to pay for it. It's these private companies.
How are they going to get the money? Are they going to get sponsors?
They can get private investors to start the company or invest in the company. An example of a private company that is genetics, I don't know if they're really doing genetic therapy. They might be doing that, I'm not sure, is Jackson Laboratories. They have their headquarters is up in Maine, in Bar Harbor. But they're an example of a private company that's doing genetic research.
And also, the cost of gene therapy is high at this time, and could be a concern for families that need lifelong treatment and do not actually have health care. So that's another concern raised, that if someone who has this terminal illness and is offered this opportunity to change to alter their genes so they could be healthy, but they don't have health insurance. What do you think that fate is for them? They can't afford the health insurance, but this is a life or death situation that they're in.
I think Obama's name comes into play here because he's, Obamacare and everything, that he's making it possible for everybody to get health insurance. I think that's kind of the road that we're on, and in the future, I think everybody will be able to get health insurance, so I think that's not too much of an issue when it comes to gene therapy. But as for the price, I can understand, as a competitor, where you're coming from. I do understand that it is a lot of money. However, it doesn't matter how much it is, in the sense that if it's saving your life, you will pay for it. Because if the other option is dying, you will do anything in your power to stop that from happening.
This also why I was talking about this triggers the fear of designer babies, or the fear of eugenics, which is a term that denotes the creation of a superior race. The idea that media has tried to embody in the concept of designer babies. So this concept of having a designer baby, where specific genes are selected in order to create the perfect child, is like, I know I have to mess up, can be similar to Hitler's attempts to create a superior race. So do we really want to have that in our society? Do we really want to have this type of class of people who are considered the perfect children and who are going to be raised to have these perfect qualities and pass these perfect qualities down to their children? Do we really want to have that separate class who are considered superior than the people who can be considered as average or normal?
I think the idea comes into play that, genetic therapy can be used for those who have, genetic disorders or diseases. So you're kind of bringing these people up from below average to average. The issue that you're addressing is when you take people that are average and you make them above average genetically. You're making them superior, as you called it.
Exactly. So, but, okay, I know what you're saying, like gene therapy. You're saying that this is like the proper way to utilize gene therapy. But what is stopping from somebody who doesn't want to utilize it that way? Like, everyone can't just say this is what gene therapy is for. Because some people could see it differently, that they want to take this opportunity and use it to better themselves or better their children.
I think that's where, laws can help in these cases, because you could have a law where...
Do you have any laws? Let me see some examples.
No, I'm saying this isn't widely used yet, so obviously they're not going to have laws for something that's not widely used. That's like, you can't fly your spaceship more than 100 miles an hour. Like, obviously that doesn't apply to us right now. But I think laws could prohibit people from creating designer babies where they're choosing what they want, and it can be just up to the doctors that, if you're taking eggs and sperm from a couple and finding which ones don't have the gene for the disorder that their kids could be predisposed to, if you're taking those out and only using eggs and sperm that don't have the disorder, then I think that's acceptable, because all you're doing is eliminating the chance that the child would get a disease or that specific disease. I think once you start getting into, I want blonde hair, blue-eyed children, and I feel like that should be outlawed, so that you could have this kind of balance where you could help the people that could have genetic disorders and kind of outlaw people that want to kind of genetically enhance. Genetic therapy can not only benefit those affected by genetic disorders directly, but also those that could inherit the disorder, as I've been saying. So if gene therapy can target reproductive cells of carriers of genetic disorders, such as Parkinson's disease or even cancer, it's possible that children of the carrier would be free of the defective gene. So if we think about this as a big picture, this means that genetic diseases could be wiped out completely. And this idea is from gtherapy.co.uk. This is probably one of the kind of bigger points, one of the most major points to make in the argument of pro to use genetic therapy, because you could wipe out genetic diseases, and that would be huge. That would be a major step in medical technology.
According to the North Dakota State University and Busel.com, they both said that manipulating genetic makeup of a man is absolutely unacceptable by those with strong religious and ethical beliefs. According to them, altering genes is similar to tinkering with nature. It's like questioning God's will, or in other words, playing God. And also, the current knowledge of this gene therapy is nearly not good enough. It's not well known enough to convince the world it's a safe and effective method of treatment. And furthermore, gene therapy opens a whole new world of knowledge in terms of knowing things about our bodies we were never meant to know. This is what I was saying about with the gene theft. And having the power to manipulate our bodies in ways we were never meant to be able to. What do you think about that? For people who have these, how would you convince somebody who takes this stance? How would you convince that the gene therapy is a proper way? Ethically speaking, not scientifically speaking.
Okay, I mean, they're really so similar, it's hard to distinguish between the two. But I would say I'd use the example of how medication is used to treat different diseases. If you have diabetes, you need insulin in order to survive and be healthy. I would say to that person, do you think that this person shouldn't have the insulin? Should they just die? Because that's the same as in this case. Should these people not, once we explore and research more and know much more about genetic therapy, it should be used to treat those that have at least terminal diseases. We could start there. It's the same thing as the diabetes example, that they need their insulin. And so if someone has Huntington's and they're going to die, we have no cure for Huntington's. The only possible cure is through genetic therapy. So in that case, they need genetic therapy in order to survive. It's the same concept. So I think I would explain it to him that way. And
according to the research I've done, there is no guarantee that the vector that's carrying this healthy gene will end up in the specific place it is intended to. So as a result, there is a risk of causing even more damage to the genetic makeup that can result in severe consequences for that patient.
Yeah, and we did refer to that before with Jesse Gelsinger. He died because of complications with gene therapy. There was another child in France through a French gene therapy, as I said before, that was affected by that. So I do understand where you're coming from, that there are a lot of risks involved, and that's why there needs to be more research before it has human uses.
Exactly.
And one more thing I wanted to say was that gene therapy provides a cure rather than just easing symptoms. So, for example, if someone is affected by cystic fibrosis, which is one of the more common genetic diseases affecting 7,500 people in the UK and around 75,000 people in the United States. And that's from helium.com. So basically, cystic fibrosis causes thick, sticky mucus to build up in the lungs as well as other body parts. And instead of just treating the buildup of the mucus through techniques that trigger, strong coughs that help loosen and clear thick mucus from the airways, the symptoms can just be eliminated through genetic therapy. So this is just one example of one genetic disease that could be cured, possibly in the future, with more research.
So overall, I do agree with the point you're making. I just, however, think it's too soon to take an affirmative stance on this position because we don't have enough evidence, we don't have enough research, we don't really have enough scientists or doctors publishing papers on this topic. Basically, all that we know is from what has been studied and hasn't really been tested fully.
But I think there is definitely a very strong promise with this because, the first person with genetic disorder was cured through gene therapy.
But then there was
the
also one that
4-year-old girl
because of gene therapy.
But yeah,
So my main fear with this would be the designer babies and having that superior race. And I know as much as human society loves reading stories and watching movies about utopian societies, I think they're very blind to realize how close we are to becoming one if we continue further with this genetic research.
I think the compromise would be to do more research and revisit the topic and have laws in place to prohibit designer babies from being born. Please visit DNApodcast.com for information about gene therapy and gene theft, with an outline of this debate along with other lessons, not only in audio format, but in a written format as well with visual aids. There's also a contact forum on there for easy access to send in feedback about the shows or any other questions you may have. Or you can email directly at info@dnapodcast.com. To keep in contact with the show, you can also like it on Facebook and follow it on Twitter, both at /DNA Podcast. Be sure to subscribe to us on iTunes if you haven't already. Just search DNA Podcast and we pop right up. So please review us on there. It's our best way to have others like yourself discover us and benefit from the show. So all the links I just mentioned you can find on our website, dnapodcast.com. Thanks for listening and join us next episode to learn and discover new advances in the scientific world.